Welcome. So I'll just, I think what I'll do is I'll talk for a little bit before I hand it over to Peter. And then hopefully we'll have some other people join us. And then what I'll do is I will probably just pause for a second to admit them. But I want to welcome you tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Katie, and I'm a librarian here that does adult services. I also do marketing and outreach. There's not a whole lot of outreach currently. It's a little difficult when you can't do things in person. But I am happy to answer any library questions you may have. And so right now we're participating in the Lyon Township's DDA Scarecrow Contest. And you can see our scarecrow on New Hudson Drive, just west of Milford Road, if you drive by there often. It was a lot of fun to put together, but I guess we're gonna get judged on it, so fingers crossed. But I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight on what you need to know about journalism, and especially give a hearty thank you to Mr. Peter Bhatia for taking the time to spend the evening with us, especially out of his busy day. But before I turn it over to him, I just want to go over a few housekeeping details. We are recording the Zoom event, so we'll be spotlighting Mr. Peter, but feel welcome to either keep your video off. If you want to, you can turn it on. I will keep everyone muted, but please, you can use the raise your hand function or the chat to ask questions or request to be unmuted so that you can ask Mr. Bhatia a question directly. He will welcome questions throughout his presentation, so it won't be reserved until the end of it. Secondly, I will be monitoring the chat. So I just want to let you know that if there's anything disruptive during this presentation, whether through sound or video, it could result in your dismissal. And that's only because we want to make sure everyone can enjoy this shared event in a comfortable and safe online environment. So I also want to invite you to participate in our upcoming virtual events, which you can find on our website at ltpl.org if you haven't already. And tomorrow we have a lunchtime financial question and answer with Vibe Credit Union at 1 p.m. So I'll be interviewing the South Lyon manager about all things financial. And then we'll have Living an Herbalife with Bevan Cohen at 6:30 p.m. And that's an LTPL Grow special event. Lastly, we welcome your feedback, if you don't mind, in the form of a short survey to share your experience with us. What's working, what isn't, what the best way of communicating with you is, and any ideas or topics for future events that you'd be interested in. We appreciate everything that is shared with us and take it into consideration when we're planning future events. We'll be sending an automatically generated email with a link to the survey tomorrow. So I hope you'll fill it out. It really helps us. All right, so thanks so much for listening to me talk a little bit about the library and what's coming up. Without further ado, I welcome Mr. Peter Bhatia, Editor and Vice President of the Detroit Free Press and Michigan Regional Editor for the USA Today Network. Oh, you're muted.
There we go. Okay, thank you. I appreciate the nice introduction. Good evening, everyone. Great to be with you. You know, I want this to be as useful a time as possible for you all. So I urge you to ask any questions or pose any comments or otherwise that you want to in the chat, or as you heard, raise your hand. So we were talking before we got started, Katie and I, about how much I love being in Michigan. I've been here 3 years, a little over 3 years now, as editor of the Free Press. I never expected to end up in Michigan. You know, I'm pretty much a West Coast guy, But when the opportunity to come to Detroit and to come to Michigan was presented to me, I leaped at the opportunity because I knew what a fascinating corner of the world it is, how wonderful a place it is. I still don't think winter's as bad in Detroit as Detroiters make it out to be, but it's not like we live in Minnesota. But it's an incredible place to be a journalist and to be in the news business. There's so much going on here, even without COVID protests and now the election coming up. I've been in journalism really my whole life, 45 years. I grew up in Eastern Washington State in a little college town called Pullman, which is the home of Washington State University. I'm the product of a professor and an artist. How that somehow combined to become a journalist was always a source of amusement or bemusement for my parents, because there were no journalists in our family. I just liked writing a lot, and I liked telling people about what's going on in the world, and so it was a logical progression. That, and when I got to college, I did really, really badly on the LSAT, the law boards. So it became a very logical career progression for me to follow my love of journalism. I've worked all over the country. Worked in Spokane, Washington, near where I grew up. Worked in San Francisco, Sacramento, Fresno, Dallas, York, Pennsylvania, which is just north, just across the Pennsylvania line from Baltimore, and was teaching. Actually, I spent most of the longest period of my career in Portland, Oregon, where I was for 21 years, and left there about 5 years ago and went to teach at the journalism school at the Cronkite School at Arizona State. Had been there about a year and a half when the Gannett Company came knocking and asked if I would consider returning to newsrooms as an editor. And I said at the time, I think I was 62 or something like that. At the time, I said, well, I'm kind of an old-time journalist, a newspaper guy. I've never worked for Google or Yahoo or anybody like that. Are you sure you want people like me? And they said, yeah, we need people like you still to run our newsrooms. So I went to Cincinnati, and I was there for 2 years. Cincinnati's a great city. It was a lot of fun being there, working there. And we were fortunate during my tenure there to win a Pulitzer Prize for our coverage of the opioid epidemic. And from there, the parent company asked me to come to Detroit and to be editor of the Free Press. So here I am 3+ years in, still learning about Michigan. I've been all over the state as best my time has permitted me. Of course, the travel's been a little more difficult of late than perhaps normal. Well, certainly than normally, but I've been coast to coast, and I haven't been to the UP yet, but I've been to Traverse and tip of the mitt. So love this place, love this. As I said, it's an incredible place to practice journalism. And one of the things that I love about Michigan is, having lived all over the country, there isn't a passion for place in the rest of the country like there is for Michigan. People, wherever, when we did travel a lot, everywhere you go, you'll run into Michiganders. And I'm fond of telling a story. I was out in Scottsdale on vacation a few years ago. I'm a big baseball fan, so I go to spring training pretty much every year. And my son, my son and I started doing that when he was a little boy, and now he's 31, and we still rendezvous at spring training every year. But we were out in Scottsdale, and we ordered Uber Eats, and the young man who shows up to deliver it is wearing a Tigers cap. So naturally, I get into conversation with him. I said, "So are you from Detroit?" And he said, "Yeah." And so we stood there, and I said, "Where are you from?" And he said, "Well, you wouldn't know." And I said, "Trust me, I would." And he was like from 8 Mile and Gratiot, basically. And I, we talked about Detroit and so on and went on. And then it finally said, "So why are you in Arizona?" And he said, "Because I couldn't take the winters." and I said, "Well, okay, you're in the right place if you want the opposite of Michigan winters to be here." This is an amazing and insane, really, time to be a journalist. The last 8 months have been indescribable, really. In a 40+ year career, I don't think I've ever worked harder than I have in the last 8 months. But I'm coming to you from the study in my condo in downtown Detroit. I actually live about 2 blocks from the Free Press offices, but we're all working remotely and have been since mid-March and continue to do that. Fortunately, we live in a time of better technology, so really all you need to do our jobs most of the time is a smartphone and a laptop and a wireless connection. And our reporters and our editors are working successfully from their homes. But like with any uh, human gathering that depends on the interaction that you have in conversation, it's a lot harder to do it because I was joking with Katie earlier. It's probably my 7th Zoom call of the day. I usually lose track most days, and we're doing our jobs through Zoom and email and other technologies to try to get the information in front of people that is so important in these times, whether it's about the virus, covering the protests through the summer, and now the countdown to the election, which is 4 weeks from tomorrow, I think. And it's just been a remarkable time. Journalism it really in any time is a bit of drinking from a fire hose. There's so much coming at you all the time. And when you live in a place that has the complexity of Detroit and Michigan, that's even more the case. And it's no secret that over time, our industry has been struggling. The recession in 7, 8, 9 was a real hard time for our industry, and the migration of advertising from print to the internet, of course, has taken a huge hit on us as well. It's actually quite remarkable how much print advertising there still is. My thesis is that print will be around as long as the baby boomers are. And since I'm a baby boomer, I hope the baby boomers are around for a long time. But we've been in this transition really since the late 90s from the traditional print world to the digital world. And that transition continues now, influenced by all kinds. I mean, the technology has made our jobs both easier and harder at the same time. And the introduction and the growth of things like social media and so on adds a complexity, both in terms of us utilizing it to get news and information out, but also in the context of trying to sort it out all the time. Because as you know, social media can get to be a bit of a cesspool sometimes. But our mission is and has been and continues to be to bring the truth to people, whatever the truth is. That's harder and harder to find these days because we live in such a polarized society and people live in silos and only want to hear what they want to hear. But we view our jobs to try and every day get information in front of people that will be useful to them, that gets at the heart of whatever the issues may be, and that gives them context. Through once COVID hit Michigan formally on March 10th, I think, on the night of the presidential primary in Michigan. The top of the front page the next morning was Biden winning the primary here. The bottom of the page was the first 2 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Michigan, and it just, of course, exploded from there. We literally put our entire staff on covering COVID through March, April, May, and into June. We had to divide it up a little bit when the protests started happening in May. And now that we're into the heart of the campaign season, we have a lot more people, of course, working on politics. We have 5 full-time reporters covering the races in Michigan. Plus, we just got a grant this week to hire some temporary people for the last month of the campaign to help us with things like fact checking and disinformation and so on and so forth, because of course there's a ton of that out there. Um, our focus at the Free Press is on Michigan. Um, it isn't on all the craziness going on in Washington. Obviously, we've covered very thoroughly the president being in the hospital the last 3 days, and now him getting out this evening. Unless something extraordinary happens tonight, the main photo on the front page of the Free Press tomorrow morning will be of the president leaving Walter Reed. And obviously we have, because Michigan is a key swing state in the election, we have a lot of national press and a lot of candidates in the state all the time. Bernie Sanders was in town today campaigning for Joe Biden. We had Jill Biden last week. Of course, Joe Biden was in Grand Rapids on Thursday, maybe. The days all kind of bleed together. Trump has rallies scheduled here later in the month that I assume by then he will still be doing, and so on. So we're going to see a lot of the candidates, and we're going to see everything that comes crashing down around the candidates between now and the end of the month. My charge to my staff has been pretty simple. And I have to tell you up front, I love politics. I'm a political reporter at heart. One of my favorite jobs in my long career was when I was a political reporter for the Spokesman Review in Spokane, Washington in the late 70s. And I wrote a story then, I'm sure I must have the clip somewhere, although I have no idea where it is, because of course they're all on paper, of the beginning of this movement around some guy named Reagan in the Republican Party, and how the Republicans in Spokane were starting to rally around his candidacy and his principles, if you will, of Republicanism at that time. So, I love that reporting. I covered a state legislature in Washington, really didn't know what I was doing because I was just a kid. So I just wrote story after story after story about what was going on. And I've always loved politics, and it is different for sure today than it was when I was a political reporter. But my charge to my staff is for there to be no surprises, that our readers should have a clear understanding by election day of where the electorate in Michigan is. So that's why we've done stories. For example, just in the last 2 weeks, we had a story. I'm sorry, again, the days all sort of roll together, but we did a story in the last week or so about how farmers in the state are sticking with President Trump, even though his policies and the tariffs and so on may have hurt them personally, because they still believe in what he stands for. And we've also had a story out of suburban Detroit about how the president is struggling with women in the suburbs who were a key voting bloc in support of him 4 years ago, but appears to be an area where he's having trouble holding on to support this time around. And we will have reporters out and about all over the state for the month we have left in the campaign, really trying to document exactly what is going on in Michigan and what the electorate is thinking. Part of my role is I'm also the Michigan editor for the USA Today network, which is our parent company, which is Gannett. In addition to the Free Press, we also have papers and newsrooms in Lansing, Port Huron, Livingston County, Battle Creek, Holland, Ionia, Sturgis, Coldwater, Hillsdale, Adrian, Monroe, Petoskey, Charlevoix, Gaylord, Sault Ste. Marie, and I'm forgetting one, Sheboygan. So I have roughly 15 other news organizations that ultimately report up to me. We actually have a meeting tomorrow to plan how we can be as effective as we can be for the people in the state the rest of the month. Sometimes it's as simple as the Holland paper covered Joe Biden in Grand Rapids last week, because obviously they're a lot closer to Grand Rapids than we are, and but also it's sort of collaborating on these mood of the voters kind of pieces that it's important for us to do as we count down to the election. This is an election unlike, I mean, every election is unique just because the candidates are unique, but this is a unique election in particular because of the way it's been framed by the candidates, because of the times we're living in the wake of the COVID pandemic and all the impact that's had on people, of course, 205,000 Americans dead, but also on the economy. And, it's been, as I mentioned earlier, I live in downtown Detroit. It's nice to see a little more normalcy, more people out on the street, more, people eating in restaurants and so on. But actually, we have a story, I think that's, it may already be on freep.com, but I think it's printing tomorrow on the strategies that restaurants will be employing because winter is coming. And, you can't really sit outside and eat dinner in 25 degrees temperatures in February. Well, you could, but it wouldn't be particularly pleasant. But and they're looking at things from tents to igloos, basically, and all manner of things. It turns out actually that it's a national story. I was on a USA Today planning call the other day, and I mentioned that we were doing this story, and about 5 other editors from around the country piped up and said, "Oh yeah, we're doing it too." Of course, it's in places like here and in New York and in New England, where they actually have winter as compared to properties in Florida or Arizona or whatever the case might be. Any questions or anything at this point? As I said, I'm happy to have you, drop in. Happy to stop talking and talk about things that you're interested in as well. So please, please feel absolutely free to say so.
Looks like Vicky has a question.
Okay, go ahead, Vicky.
I was just wondering, what do you think about the reputation or what the public thinks about journalists and journalism now, from like maybe the heights of Watergate, where rock stars to now? Do you think there's really a change, or is that just sort of a myth in a way? With
yeah, it's a really good question. I don't think it's a myth at all. There's a whole. I was actually a summer intern in 1974, and brought my little teeny little black and white TV into the newsroom because there weren't TVs in newsrooms then, at least in the newsroom in Spokane, so we could have the Watergate hearings on, and ultimately could watch when President Nixon left the White House on August 8th, I think, 1974, something like that. And a whole generation of journalists went into the business because we were the thing to do after Woodward and Bernstein and all that. There's still a huge cadre of young people who want to be journalists, which is encouraging to me. Journalism school enrollment around the country. One of my side hobbies, if you will, is that I'm president of the organization that accredits college journalism schools. And so I visit a couple of campuses every year to evaluate their programs and see reports on every school that might be going up for accreditation in any given year. And the enrollments are still really good at journalism schools. A lot of young people still want to be journalists. Now, partly the enrollment too is being fueled by people who want to go into PR and advertising, because that's typically taught in journalism schools. So, but still, I'm encouraged all the time by the quality of young people that I see in our newsrooms coming in as interns or getting hired to work there. I don't think there's any question that the credibility of journalists has taken a dive in the last many years. The president's relentless and wrong criticism of journalism has had a big impact on that. And I think that for those of us who labor in local newsrooms and are dedicated to coverage of where we live, it's affected us a lot less than it has the national media, because a lot of the criticism is aimed at the talking heads on Sunday morning. It's the cable news networks and their strongly, obviously held political positions and so on that have damaged to a great degree the credibility of journalism. It's kind of like, I forget who it may have been Tip O'Neill or some other politician said it sometimes that all politics are local, and that the old cliche about they're all crooks except for my member of Congress or my representative. I think a lot of people feel that way about their local news organizations. Partly because we're covering things that they care about or that touch their lives in some way, even if it's reporting how crummy the Lions are, or whatever the case might be, or for that matter, all of our sports teams at the moment.
Mhm.
But that they know that, at least in the case of the Free Press, that we care about local issues, and that we're going to do our best to cover those in an aggressive and accurate way. But journalists are down there with members of Congress, and when you see those ratings about how what are the more respected professions and so on. All I know is the people I work with are incredible professionals. They care passionately about telling stories that make a difference. They care passionately about telling them accurately and completely balanced, truthfully. But I'm not going to tell you I don't get, I have my regular correspondents, of course, who like to trash me by email, but
Mhm.
the number of times somebody throws fake news in my face is very rare.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
And
sure.
if I could just one more question
Sure.
on a lighter note, what is your favorite newspaper movie?
Oh, what a great question. Oh, wow. There's so many good ones.
Mhm.
Probably The Front Page,
Okay.
which is, of course, incredibly goofy movie.
Mhm.
It's really more a comedy than anything else.
Right. No, that's
Um,
fine. Yeah.
But I love it. I mean, I lived through All the President's Men, of course. So, and Jason Robards got Ben Bradley so right, just like Liv Schreiber got Marty Baron so right in Spotlight,
Spotlight.
the most recent one, which I thought was excellent.
Yeah.
There's some I didn't like as much, like Absence of Malice, which was in the news recently for some reason. Somebody associated with it passed away, I think, or something like that. It might have been Kurt Ludke, who's a former editor of the Free Press. He may have written that screenplay, but I may have that wrong.
Mhm.
But I like the question. Thanks. none of them will knock Casablanca off the top of my all-time favorite movies list, however.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Of course.
All right, Shelby had a question. I'm going to ask her to unmute.
Hi, yeah, thank you. Actually,
Sure.
it's my 10-year-old daughter who has the question. She is writing her own newspaper and has
Cool.
a question for you about, well, go ahead, Matilda, you can ask your question.
Hi, Matilda.
Hello. Yeah, I do write a newspaper. I talk a lot about politics, which I also love to write about. So I'm like a fan. But my question was, when you were writing, how do you narrow down and put one focus on a specific topic? Because I realize I'm struggling with, like, I talk about something else, like that you should vote, and I put in little links about that, and then I start talking about COVID-19 and the levels of struggle. So I want to kind of narrow down.
How do you learn to narrow down your focus, or what
Right.
advice would you have for her about how she could do that?
Shelby, Matilda needs to go to Harvard right now.
very aware that she is going to eclipse any and all accomplishments that I've made in my life. But that's in and of itself a great accomplishment. So thank you for that.
Matilda, it's a great question. And I think every writer struggles with that. Finding, the key is asking yourself and talking through with yourself, what exactly is the story about? What is the central theme of the story? What's the spine on which the story is built? Because when you know what the story is really, and sometimes it's obvious because you're covering a speech and somebody says something and you write it. But most stories, especially, with COVID stories, because we've written hundreds of them, we have to spend time, our writers and our editors have to spend time talking and thinking about, okay, what is the point of what we're trying to say here? Is it a story about how there have been clusters of COVID cases in nursing homes and the impact on the elderly who are in those nursing homes, for example? Is it a focus on how COVID has changed our lives? Or is it a focus on people who have died from the virus or whatever, or been really deeply sickened by the virus? Or is it a story about healthcare providers who are, the real heroes in all of this, who are in there in the trenches, in the hospitals, in the clinics every day, and potentially risking their lives if they get exposed to the virus? So it's, one of the problems a lot of really even accomplished journalisms make is they sort of treat their story like a stew. So they throw in the meat and they throw in the vegetables and they put in the seasoning and they add the sauce or whatever. And what you get can be pretty good, but it may not be so good for you. So I mean, with a news story, it's really saying, okay, this is the heart of the story. These are the 2 or 3 or 4 or whatever the number might be, key elements of the story, because you really want to write a story that people get into and are pulled along by the way you've written it and all the information that you offer them. But if you go, sort of wandering around all over the place and aren't focused on the heart of the story, what it's really truly about, you're going to lose people. Because you need to engage with them and you have to show them that reading what you're writing is worth their time. Does that help a little?
Yes, thank you so much. I have trouble with that, and I always have to narrow it down, and I delete a lot of my hard work. So thank you.
Every journalist has that issue. And thankfully, that's why we have editors, people like me who say, no, here, not there, to help our writers, get to where they need to get to.
Thank you.
Sure. Excuse me.
Well, I'm curious if there are still, are they called copywriters or copy editors, or if that's all been just kind of subsumed into one position now for journalists?
Yeah, I was a copy editor at one time, and those are the people who would do the final edits on stories and write headlines and things like that for the paper. Now we write headlines for the paper, but also, of course, for the website. And everybody participates that, including reporters. Reporters used to have the excuse, hey, I don't write the headlines. Well, now in the digital world, because we're doing more with less. Sorry for the cliche, but that's really the way it works. Everybody writes headlines. So copy editors, have fallen by the wayside to a large degree. We still have, for the purpose of differentiation, line editors. So people who are the reporters editors who do edits on the stories. It used to be a story might go through another 2 or 3 edits before it actually was published. We don't have the staff to do that many edits anymore. Obviously, on any sensitive story or major investigation or something like that, there would be multiple editors on it, perhaps even me, depending on the story. But that art form is fading away, unfortunately. And my wife, who's a retired journalist, was a copy editor too at one time in her career. So it's something that's important in our family. Any other questions? I can talk some more if people want me to.
Well, I'm also curious about like the hotline for tips, or I know on like ABC7, they sometimes will share that you can send in your information if you've witnessed something. Is that something that happens fairly regularly?
Yes, it does. And one of the truths of journalism is that so many really, really important story ideas, things that turn into really important stories, come from tips from the public. Reporters dig up a lot of things too, and might spend hours in the courthouse going through records to find things, and to analyze campaign donations or something to that effect. But the public are really helpful. Really helpful eyes and ears for us all the time. Because I mean, it can be as small as there's this mammoth pothole, on Livernois or something, or it can be something much more important, leading us in repertorial directions that yield important information. Jim Schaefer, who's on our staff and is one of the reporters who won the Pulitzer Prize for the work on Kwame Kilpatrick, talks about how they tried every legal means they could think of to get the mayor's text messages that were so at the heart of all of that craziness at the time. They finally got them when I think somebody slipped an envelope under a door with the text message and something to that effect. I don't have the story quite right, but so sometimes all the digging and hard work and hours of interviews and so on that reporters do still yield so much of the journalism that we get, but we'd be nowhere without the public telling us about stuff, because even as much as we try, we can't be everywhere, obviously. And that's still a big part of how we do our work. Well, let me just talk. Is it all right if I talk a little bit more? Okay. Let me just talk a little bit more about what excuse me, my chair is really uncomfortable. What journalism is like these days. It's such an interesting contrast. The question about journalism, movies, and so on, and you go back to the smoke-filled rooms and guys with notebooks and pencils and banging on manual typewriters and so on and so forth. When I started my career, that still existed. It was before, offices had smoking bans. It was before computerization. And our tools as reporters were our notebooks and our pencils, and then coming back to type our stories. Eventually, we converted into electric typewriters, which were awful things. But and then eventually to computer terminals. The first, now when you're all on your laptops or whatever for this conversation, we had these giant boxes with green screens on them where you sort of had to hard code things to write your stories or write a headline or whatever the case was. Now now of course we have very, very sophisticated softwares that of course prepare things for the web and so on and so forth. But I tell students all the time that this is the best time, and in some ways the most difficult time to ever be a journalist, because we have so many tools now. It used to be, if we wanted to find out, who owns the building at 160 West 4th Street in downtown Detroit, you'd have to go to the courthouse and pull records. Now you just Google it, And that happens to be our building and it's owned by Bedrock. But and you can background somebody pretty much in seconds, when it used to be, a tedious process of making phone calls, pulling the paper clips out of what was called the morgue, the newspaper library, where things were stuffed in envelopes, and you've seen that in the movies too, and now it's all at our fingertips. And really, the tools for a reporter now are their smartphone, and that's really all they need, because on the smartphone you can make pictures, you can shoot video, you can edit both and send them back to the office almost immediately. You can take notes, you can do an interview, record an interview, you can do everything with it. You could even, if you wanted to, I mean, people don't because it would be tedious, you can even write your story on it if you wanted to. They're still going to come back to their computers and write the stories, or go home and, now because we're working remotely, write the stories. But so you've got a reporter today has to have all these skills that it used to be just write and report. And write and report is still the most important skills we have as reporters, but we also have to have all these other supplemental skills, and we have to be able to work in the computer system and properly code things and so on and so forth. It's cool having all the tools, and it's amazing. Our photographers can, if they're at a Lions game in Ford Field, they can basically transmit from there immediately, and boom, pictures are on the web almost instantaneously. We still edit and make choices about photos, but the technology allows us to be almost instantly transmitting news and information, and it's really quite something for the latest, for the new generation of reporters, the 20 and 30 somethings. This is how it's always been. But for those of us who've been around for a while and have lived through this evolution, it's really been incredible and fun. The important point is the heart of journalism never changes. It's still about the ability to report and to write, for reporters, obviously, and photographers to make compelling photos. And now, of course, they do videos, and we even have people on our staff who do documentary films. But so the heart of journalism is the same, but the technique and the ability to do it in a much more wide-ranging way is really something else. It's just been such a fun journey for somebody like me, who actually worked very, very briefly in the old days of hot type and linotypes, and you may have seen them in a museum or and so on, when the pages were built upside down and backwards, because they went through this whole process to make heavy metal plates that went on the press. Now the plates are all basically plastic, and the process is incredibly faster. So, like so many industries, technology changed what we did, generally for the better. But of course, technology also disrupted us, because when Craigslist and things like that came along, our traditional classified business, which had been a huge revenue support for newspapers for generations, basically went away. And the reality, we sell a ton of advertising, of course, onto Freep.com. Every news organization does, but the amount of money that a digital ad brings in is minuscule compared to the amount of money a traditional print ad brings in or brought in. We're fortunate in Detroit that we still have a pretty strong print base, which helps sustain our newspapers, but it's still a struggle for everybody in the industry these days. But it's funny. After all these years of doing this, I still love what we do. There's nothing quite like a great story, whether it's a richly told narrative about people overcoming some defying the odds in some way, or whether it's we've made a point during the epidemic of, we've done this thing called Lives Remembered, which is we've published I don't remember how many, but dozens and dozens of obituaries on people killed by the virus who are not celebrities, who are not prominent people in the community. They're just good people who lived good lives and had their lives taken away by the virus. And we just wanted to celebrate them as part of our offerings on the virus at the same time, while we're trying to hold government officials accountable for their performance in fighting the virus, and of course documenting everything that's gone on in Michigan, which has been interesting in its own right. Maybe not quite as crazed as the national scene has been, but nonetheless a really challenging and interesting time. And our job, basically our emphasis on the virus was to give people information they needed, hold government and institutions accountable for how they were dealing with it, and capture the humanity of it, both through extraordinary achievement by doctors and nurses and other healthcare professionals, but also by people whose lives were cut short by the virus. And and now whatever it is, 7 months into it, that's still the same. I started to say earlier, when the virus first broke out, we put everybody on it, including the sports writers, because all the sports were canceled and they didn't really have anything to do. So, I mean, they did, but we pulled a bunch of them over to help with the coverage of the virus too. Now they're getting, as sports sort of restart, solo keeps getting stopped by virus outbreaks. And of course the Big Ten's going to start up here pretty quickly. I forget when, but it's relatively soon. And so there's a little return to normalcy there, but we're still covering the virus. We were out on the streets pretty much every night for the first several weeks of the protests after the death of George Floyd. And as I mentioned, now we're all over the place covering politics. Never a dull moment in Detroit, but it's really kind of been on steroids since March. That's for sure.
So I did have a question.
Yes.
I know in movies and TV shows that newsrooms can be really chaotic, especially if they get a tip on a story that's about to break. Is that pretty representative of how it is in real life?
Yeah, it's not as chaotic as it used to be, but yes, when a big story breaks, there'll be a huddle of people, around a television watching what's going on. Or I love newsrooms, and this election night's going to be different, of course, because we'll be doing most of it socially distanced, but there'll be or remotely, but there'll still be a lot of people in the newsroom on election night. Places just humming. But yeah, I mean, I've been in newsrooms on a lot of days and nights when a huge story was happening, and everybody's flying around, people are shouting, people are running out the door, people are running in, and so on and so forth. The nature of our work is, journalism doesn't happen on a time clock, of course. And, I've been involved in, I lived in San Francisco when Jonestown happened, which was, largely people from the Bay Area. And then a couple of weeks later when Harvey Milk and the mayor of San Francisco were assassinated. And, we just basically worked nonstop for weeks through that period of time, and you dashed home and grabbed a few hours sleep and then came back. And there's nothing, I mean, it can sound a little ghoulish, but it's not really. I mean, when there's a big story, journalists are at their best. And nowadays, of course, you run out there and you're dictating or you're talking into your smartphone and feeding stuff to somebody who's putting it right on the web in pretty much real time. Back in the day, you might be, you see this in the old movies. Somebody calls in and gets rewrite, and there's somebody smoking a cigarette and probably has a fedora on, and they're typing in a typewriter, taking a feed from somebody in the field. That's the way it was done then, and it's not entirely different now. It's just done with faster and with technology that and nobody smokes anymore. But that well, a few people do, but most people don't smoke anymore, and it's still kind of the same when a big story was breaking. And now, of course, like with the protests, we had photographers out doing live streams from the protests, so walking with the protesters and observing things as they went on. And on the one night up on, I think it was up on Gratiot, when the police sort of converged on the protesters and arrested a bunch of them, we were there basically broadcasting that live because of the ability to live stream now. And what used to be sort of TV's world is now anybody's world, because anybody can live stream from their smartphone, and they do. This is mineral water, by the way, just for the record, if anybody's wondering what I'm drinking.
Another myth busted. This is Vicky again. I just had a question. Do you see bloggers and podcasters as competition, or what do you feel about that now? You just sort of mentioned that about, anyone can live stream.
That's right. And really anybody with anybody can be a journalist now. And I know that's been vexing, for example, to public agencies at time. I remember when I was editor in Portland, I think it was the city of Lake Oswego wanted us to side with them on keeping a sort of a gadfly blogger who was always criticizing them out of city council meetings. And they wanted us to be on their side on that. And I said, whoa, wait a minute. Same First Amendment protects that guy as protects us. He's got as much right to be there as we do. So on the one hand, we don't want to be associated with them journalistically, because, as the so-called mainstream press, which has become kind of a pejorative in some ways, it's like it means we're old or something. We still have pretty, I'm trying to think of the right word. Certainly a deeply held set of values and ethics. That governs how we do our work. A blogger may or may not be that way, and we see that all the time in national politics and other things, where somebody reports something that's completely out of left field, and that's why there's been this rise of fact checking. The latest one being at the last debate that Biden was wearing a wire. Well, he wasn't wearing a wire. I mean, that, people had to fact check that. I'm not even exactly sure where that came from, but so, the democratization, if you will, of journalism in that sense, that where anybody can be a journalist, has its perils. Our approach to that is we do our kind of journalism, and we know that we're far from perfect, obviously, but because we're human, we make mistakes, but that we're going to do our job governed by the values and ethics that define us. And if others don't conduct themselves that way, it probably adds to our responsibility to try to be professional about what we do. I think that it's not all bad what's happened. More, my view has always been more journalism is good. And the growth of nonprofit news sites here in Detroit, but also around the country, that share the so-called mainstream values means more journalism when the traditional journalism sources like us and the TV stations have been going through some rough times. So, there's an upside to it and a downside to it, but at the end of the day, what matters to us is that we do things the right way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Sure. Anyone else? Any other questions? I really appreciate you hanging in.
Okay, I've got another one.
Okay.
Has the way to conduct research, has it changed in journalism schools, and if it has, what has been the change? How research is done?
Yeah, it's a great question. A lot of journalism schools actually teach research as part of the undergraduate curriculum. So, these days, that's as much as anything about how to be really facile on the web, how to find things, how to find the right website with the right information, with verifiable information and so on, as compared to more traditional academic research. That really is a skill that, along with the things I mentioned earlier, that young journalists have to have. They've grown up in the era of search engines, and so they're digital natives, so it's a lot more familiar to them, but than it would be to somebody like me who's had to learn it. Whereas to even my 31 and 34-year-old children, it's they don't have to think twice. They just know what to do. I have to think twice sometimes, but so I think that the ability to find information accurately, quickly, and completely is even more commonplace than it used to be. There are different levels of searching for information, though. I mean, especially when you get into really deep dive investigations that involve public records and knowing how to use freedom of information legislation and so on to try to get to the bottom of things. That's a lot more complicated exercise and a much more specialized skill. The other thing that's risen up in the last decade or so is data reporters. That is, people who are just really skilled in crunching databases, and I like to say they make the numbers dance. Put them into some sort of context and value from these huge data sets that might come from a government agency or somewhere else. Those skills are really in demand in newsrooms. We have an incredibly talented, smart data person on our staff who she does things I don't even begin to understand how she does it. But that's a real part of that research question now as well.
Thank you.
Sure.
Well, it's 8:02. I really want to say congrats on the Pulitzer that you guys got.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and then also I probably don't speak for everyone, but I think it bears being said. I want to say thanks for featuring the Michiganders that we lost to COVID. I think that's just such a nice tribute to everybody, especially during this really difficult time.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, if there aren't any more questions or any comments, I want to thank everyone so much for joining us tonight. And I especially want to thank you, Peter, for sharing your insight and many years of experience and talking about journalism and how it's stayed the same, but also changed over the years. So we're really grateful that you took the time out of your busy schedule to spend a little bit of time with us.
Sure. And hey, Shelby, I think Matilda was your daughter. if there's anything I can do for her going forward, please don't hesitate to have her reach out to me.
Oh, thank
P-
you.
pbhatia@freepress.com.
Thank you so much.
That would be great. I
Thank
think she
you.
would love to consult you at some point. So
I would love that. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Good night, everybody. Thank you so much. Thanks, Katie.
Good night. Have a good night. Thank you so much. Everyone enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.